In 1847, at a candlelit slave auction buried deep in the American South, a young woman stood chained and silent. The auctioneer laughed as he lowered her price again and again, calling her ugly, cursed, unwanted. No one wanted her, yet every man who eventually bought her would lose his mind. Some screamed in the night, some locked her away, and one was found dead, eyes wide open, still staring at her face. This is her story. If you're brave enough to hear it, subscribe to Midnight Epoch. Hit the bell icon so you never miss our darkest tales, and listen closely, because this story doesn't want to be forgotten. In 1847, at a candlelit slave auction buried deep in the American South, a young woman stood chained and silent. The auctioneer laughed as he lowered her price again and again, calling her ugly, cursed, unwanted. No one wanted her, yet every man who eventually bought her would lose his mind. Some screamed in the night, some locked her away, and one was found dead, eyes wide open, still staring at her face. Tonight, this is her story. If you're brave enough to hear it, subscribe to Midnight Epoch, hit the bell icon so you never miss our darkest tales, and listen closely, because this story doesn't want to be forgotten. The clerk told himself, as the wagon wheels creaked away from the auction yard and the girl sat opposite him with her hands folded neatly in her lap, that fear was simply a habit learned from listening to other people's nonsense, that men ruined themselves with stories long before reality ever touched them, and so when they reached his modest plantation quarters at the edge of the county, he gave her work immediately, almost aggressively, as if motion alone could dissolve whatever unease lingered in the air. She was instructed where to sleep, where to eat, where not to go, and she acknowledged every command with a quiet nod that was neither submissive nor defiant, merely precise. And for the first few days nothing happened. No accidents, no strange behavior, no whispers in the night. Only the steady rhythm of labor, her movements efficient but oddly graceful. Her presence strangely difficult to ignore even when she was not in the room, and the clerk found himself watching her from doorways longer than necessary, studying the way she walked without dragging her feet, the way she never startled when spoken to suddenly, the way her eyes seemed to rest on objects rather than people, as if she were measuring the world instead of reacting to it. It was on the third night that sleep first abandoned him, not violently, not yet, but subtly, with a dream that felt less like imagination and more like memory, in which he woke within the dream to find her standing at the foot of his bed, unchained, unblinking, her face half lit by moonlight that did not belong to any window he recognized, and though she did not move or speak, the weight of her attention pressed so heavily on his chest that he woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart racing as if he had been running. And when he lit a candle and searched the room, finding nothing disturbed and the door still bolted, he laughed shakily at himself and blamed the heat, the drink, the stress of debt. Yet the following night the dream returned, identical in detail, right down to the angle of her head and the way the shadows bent around her eyes, and again he woke convinced that someone had been there. So convinced that he checked the locks twice, then 3 times, only to find her exactly where she should have been at dawn, already awake, already working. Her expression unchanged, by his bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. By the 5th night, the dreams began bleeding into the day, brief moments when he would glance up from his ledgers and swear he saw her reflection in the glass of the cabinet behind him, or feel a presence standing just out of view, and when he turned sharply, heart-pounding, there was nothing there except the lingering sense of have. Ing interrupted something that had been quietly watching him, and though he never spoke to her beyond what was necessary, he began to notice details he could not unsee. The way she never asked questions, the way she never sighed or groaned under heavy work, the way her gaze lingered a fraction of a second too long when he passed, not fixed, not hostile, just aware, deeply, uncomfortably aware. His appetite vanished first, meals left untouched as nausea twisted his stomach for reasons he could not name. Then his handwriting deteriorated, neat columns collapsing into jagged lines as his hands shook uncontrollably, and still he told no one, because how could he explain that nothing had actually happened, that no rule had been broken, no word spoken, no threat made, only the growing certainty that his thoughts were no longer private, that when he lay awake at night replaying the day's smallest interactions, there was a second presence moving through those memories with him. Examining them from another angle, he began sleeping with the candle lit, then with the door unbolted despite knowing better, and on the seventh night he awoke to the sound of breathing that was not his own, slow and measured, close enough to feel, and when he sat upright with a strangled cry, the sound stopped instantly, leaving behind a silence so complete it rang in his ears, and in the morning he confronted her at last, his voice cracking as he demanded to know if she had entered his room, if she had touched anything, if she understood the rules, and she looked at him with the same calm she had shown since the auction, tilting her head slightly as if considering his words, before shaking it once, slowly, a gesture so controlled it unsettled him more than anger would have. Days blurred together after that, time stretching and compressing unpredictably, nights growing longer, heavier, until he began to dread sunset with a physical ache in his chest, knowing that sleep would bring her closer again, that dreams would peel back whatever thin barrier remained between his thoughts and hers, and neighbors noticed the change, the way he jumped at sudden noises, the way he flinched when her name, if it could be called that, was mentioned, the way he locked himself indoors long after dark, and when they asked if she was causing trouble, he denied it too quickly, insisting she was obedient, quiet, useful, because admitting the truth, that she did nothing at all, made him sound insane. It was on the 12th night that the dream changed, that she finally spoke, though her lips never moved, her voice arriving directly inside his head with a clarity that froze him in place, calling his name not as a question, but as a statement, as if she had always known it, and in that moment the terror became absolute, because fear could be explained, but familiarity could not, and he woke screaming so loudly that a stable hand ran to the house, finding him curled on the floor, clutching his skull as if trying to hold himself together, babbling that she was watching, that she was waiting, that she did not sleep because she did not need to. After that night, he could no longer bring himself to be alone with her, issuing commands through others, avoiding rooms she had passed through, yet the sense of her presence only grew stronger, more intimate, as if distance meant nothing at all. And when he finally sold her, rushing the transaction through without negotiation, losing money he could not afford to lose, he did so with hands that would not stop shaking and eyes that refused to meet hers, because he understood now, in the marrow of his bones, that ownership had never belonged to him, that whatever she was, whatever silence she carried, it had already entered him, had already rearranged something essential. And as the wagon took her away and the sound of hooves faded down the road, relief washed over him so violently that he wept, convinced the nightmare had ended, unaware that the absence she left behind would prove just as unbearable, because even after she was gone, even after her figure vanished from sight, the feeling of being observed did not fade, and deep in the quiet of his ruined sleep, the certainty remained that she had not followed him home that first night. She had been there long before he ever closed his eyes. When the clerk passed her on with unseemly haste, barely accepting payment and refusing to answer questions, the man who received her believed he was inheriting not a problem but a purpose, for the preacher had built his life on the conviction that darkness existed only to prove the necessity of light, and rumors to him were merely unchallenged lies that grew fat on fear. So when he first saw her standing quietly beside the wagon, chains loose but present, posture straight, eyes steady, he felt neither dread nor unease but a surge of righteous resolve, the comforting certainty that he had been placed in her path for a reason, that God, in his infinite design, had delivered to him a soul in need of correction and cleansing. He spoke to her gently at first, introducing himself as a servant of the Lord, assuring her that obedience and prayer would wash away whatever stain had made men recoil from her, and when she answered with silence, polite, complete silence, he mistook it for humility, for gratitude even, interpreting her calm as the quiet of someone finally safe, finally guided, and it pleased him, because he believed obedience was the first sign of salvation. He brought her to the small house attached to his chapel, a place filled with hymns and scripture and the heavy smell of old books, and immediately set about remaking her, not through cruelty, but through ritual, renaming her with a biblical name he chose himself, insisting she repeat it until it belonged to her, forcing her to kneel in prayer at dawn and dusk, guiding her hands when she did not move quickly enough, correcting her posture when her stillness unsettled him, and for a time it seemed to work, because she complied with everything, every prayer, every hymn, every reading from the good book delivered in his resonant, confident voice. Yet even as he congratulated himself on his success, something subtle began to shift within him, an irritation he could not place, a faint discomfort that lingered after each session, because though she repeated the words when commanded, they carried no inflection, no warmth, no resistance either, as if language itself was simply another motion to perform, no different from sweeping the floor or carrying water. At night, as he prepared sermons by lamplight, he found himself pausing mid-sentence, struck by the sudden and inexplicable thought that she might be listening, not with her ears but with something else. And when he dismissed the idea and returned to his writing, the words on the page no longer flowed as they once had. Sermons that used to rise effortlessly, now tangled into obsessive repetitions about purity, temptation, and the dangers of the flesh, and his congregation noticed, exchanging uneasy glances as he lingered too long on certain passages, his eyes unfocused, voice strained. As though he were preaching not to them but to an unseen presence just beyond the pulpit, he began locking her inside during services, telling himself it was for her own good, that the world was not ready for her yet, but the truth was simpler and more disturbing. He could not concentrate when she was nearby, could not bear the sense that her attention followed him even when she was out of sight, and though he never caught her watching him, never found her where she should not be, the pressure of her awareness grew heavier with each passing day, seeping into his thoughts, his prayers, his dreams, until even the act of speaking God's name brought no comfort. The dreams began subtly, images of standing alone in the chapel at night, candles extinguishing themselves one by one as he recited scripture louder and low, only to realize that the words were no longer reaching his ears, that they were being absorbed by the darkness itself. And always, at the edge of the dream, she stood unmoving, her face unreadable, her gaze steady, and when he woke, heart pounding, he would rush to her room with a lantern, only to find her seated exactly where she had been left, eyes open, awake, as if sleep were a concept that did not apply to her. And when he demanded to know why she was not resting, she replied softly, for the first time, that she was, and the simplicity of the answer chilled him more than defiance ever could. His faith, once a fortress, began to crack under the weight of contradiction, because everything he had been taught told him that evil announced itself, that corruption fought back, that sin screamed when challenged. Yet she did none of these things. She did not resist prayer, did not recoil from Scripture, did not react when he sprinkled holy water across her hands and brow, and that absence of reaction gnawed at him, because it left no enemy to confront, no battle to win, only the unsettling possibility that his tools were meaningless, that his authority ended at the surface of her skin. He began fasting, then obsessively cleansing the house, scrubbing floors until his hands bled, burning incense until the air grew thick and choking, convinced that if he purified the space enough, whatever watched him through her eyes would be forced to leave. And yet the more he prayed, the more his thoughts betrayed him, twisting Scripture into accusation, turning passages about temptation into personal confessions he could not silence. And soon his sermons changed again, shifting from reassurance to warning, from mercy to punishment, his voice rising as he spoke of women as vessels of downfall, of unseen snares set for righteous men, and some in the congregation stopped attending altogether, uneasy with the fire in his eyes, the way he glanced toward the door as if expecting someone to enter at any moment. The breaking point came late one night when, exhausted and shaking, he confronted her in the small room where she slept, demanding she confess whatever sin clung to her, whatever curse had followed her from market to market, and she listened patiently, head slightly tilted, until his voice cracked and fell into sobs, and only then did she respond. Not with defiance or mockery, but with a simple question spoken so quietly it barely disturbed the air. Why was he afraid of her? And in that moment, something inside him collapsed, because he had no answer that did not indict himself, no explanation that did not reveal the fragility of his faith, and terror flooded his chest, raw and humiliating, and he fled the room shouting Scripture at the walls, at the ceiling, at God himself, begging for deliverance, for forgiveness, for the strength to banish whatever had taken root in his mind. By morning he was gone, abandoning his chapel, his calling, his congregation, leaving behind only his notes, pages filled with frantic underlining and contradictions, and her, seated quietly in the house, untouched, unrestrained, waiting as she always did. And when townspeople came searching days later, drawn by the silence, they found no sign of struggle, no evidence of escape, only the lingering sense that something had passed through and moved on, unchanged, and as they led her away once more, whispers followed, darker now, more certain, because a man of God had tried to save her and failed, and if faith itself could not reach whatever lay behind her eyes, then perhaps the truth was not that she carried evil with her, but that she revealed it, patiently, inexorably, until those who believed themselves righteous could no longer bear the sight of what stared back at them from the depths of their own souls. By the time she passed into the hands of her fourth owner, the air around her was already thick with murmurs, those hushed, nervous voices that lingered in kitsch, inns, church pews and market squares, speaking of a girl who had been bought and sold more times than any living soul should endure, yet who seemed impervious to both labor and malice, and though each new buyer claimed to understand her, each carried her away convinced they could mold or control her, only to return her in fear, in haste, or in disbelief, and the whispers began to take on a life of their own, feeding on the stories of those who had failed to possess her, growing longer, stranger, more certain with each retelling. It was said first that she did not blink as others did, that while eyes shift, flicker, and glance nervously about the room, hers remained steady, unmoving, and that when she did blink it was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, the kind of blink that suggested a pause for calculation rather than instinct, as if she were measuring the intentions of every soul nearby, weighing them, cataloguing them, recording their worth in some unfathomable ledger, and people began to notice this in subtle ways. A servant stepping out of a room would return to find her gaze lingering on them, though she had not moved, had not spoken, had not made the slightest sound, and the observer would feel a sudden unease, a tightening of the chest, as if invisible fingers pressed down upon their heart, a sensation that did not go away even once the girl herself was out of sight. Then came the stories about mirrors, that wherever she stood before one, however briefly, a crack would appear somewhere on its surface, faint at first, almost imperceptible, but growing over time, like frost spreading over glass, and while no one could confirm the cause, no man, woman, or child could deny the coincidence, and this only served to heighten the legend around her, because in a world so tied to the physical, so reluctant to believe in the intangible, the evidence of broken reflections was terrifyingly tangible, proof that she left some mark beyond memory, beyond fear. Dogs, too, were said to avoid her, a detail so small, so easily dismissed, yet repeated so often that it could not be ignored, for hunters and farmers alike swore their animals would cower or retreat when she entered a room, snapping at empty air, trembling at the mere presence of her silhouette. And some even claimed that the birds, those silent witnesses of the skies, would fall silent when she walked beneath their branches, as though the natural world itself recognized a dissonance in her existence, a misalignment between what was and what should be. The whispers grew bolder over time, evolving into stories, into warnings whispered by mothers to daughters, by servants to fellow staff, by men wary of ridicule if they spoke too openly yet unable to keep the secret of their unease, and the language of her presence became coded. She was not merely a girl, she was a test, a reckoning, a mirror held up to men who thought they could own, control, or define her, and those who ignored the warnings quickly found themselves in trouble of a kind that could not be explained with medicine, prayer, or reason. She was sold again, as had become inevitable, moving from household to household, each owner believing they were the exception, that they could succeed where others had failed, that faith, money, or discipline could bend her to their will, and yet the cycle repeated itself with a precision that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence, for the patterns were too consistent, too cruel. Obsession grew first, creeping into waking thoughts, invading quiet moments. Then fear, sudden and visceral, slithering into the chest like ice, and finally, madness. Unpredictable in its expression yet undeniable in its presence, a collapse so complete that families refused to speak of it, blaming grief, illness, or divine punishment without ever acknowledging the girl who had caused it all. Some claimed she was not truly ugly at all, that the description had been a ruse of perception, the result of fear, the human need to rationalize what cannot be understood, that in truth her features were harmonious, even beautiful, but that they carried something so fundamentally wrong in the mind's eye that men could not reconcile it with their expectations, and so they labeled her ugly, cursed, undesirable, anything to make the discomfort stop, to maintain the illusion that the world remained ordered, that they remained sane. There were those who watched her work for hours, unable to look away, their fascination edged with dread, their admiration tempered by a creeping horror that what they felt was not desire but recognition of a truth they were too afraid to name. And when she finally noticed them, when her gaze met theirs directly, men said it was as if she looked inside them, seeing all their hidden vices, their smallest sins, their unspoken cruelties, their secret thoughts that they would never confess, and it was in that scrutiny that the seed of madness was planted. For when a person comes face to face with an unblinking mirror of the soul, there is no refuge, no denial, no comfort in prayer or reason, only the cold, unwavering certainty that they are seen as they truly are. Whispers began to mingle with rumors of the supernatural, that she was touched by forces beyond mortal understanding, that she carried with her a curse not of malice but of revelation, and soon entire towns began to speak of her in hushed tones, avoiding her path when possible, watching from the distance as she walked calmly down the street, chains at her wrists now a relic of the past, and some said her pace was too deliberate, her steps measured as if she were attuned to a rhythm no one else could hear, a rhythm that synchronized with the heartbeat of those around her, amplifying fear, curiosity, obsession, and dread in equal measure. Men who purchased her began to notice that their thoughts were no longer private, that ideas they considered secret, personal, or shameful would bubble unbidden to the surface, that anxieties they had suppressed for years became unbearable, that the act of thinking itself seemed to provoke a reaction from somewhere unseen, somewhere patient, somewhere waiting, and attempts to flee or avoid her proved futile, for wherever she was taken, the pattern repeated. The observer became the victim of their own mind, haunted by something they could not name, watched by eyes that did not blink, judged by a presence that did not speak. Children whispered in corners that she could see the invisible, that she knew the truths adults feared to admit, and mothers crossed themselves when she passed, muttering prayers that sounded hollow even to their own ears, because no god they invoked had yet offered protection from the subtle terror she carried, the terror that crept quietly, slowly, so that only the attentive or the unlucky would notice it in time. Men began writing down experiences, letters never sent, journal entries that spoke of sleepless nights and murmured warnings, of waking to find her in rooms where she had no reason to be, of doors that were locked yet somehow open, of reflections in glass that betrayed no image but a sense of presence, and all of it traced back to a girl who did nothing except exist, who spoke when spoken to, who obeyed and yet somehow remained untouchable, untamed, unclassified, and as these accounts circulated, the story itself took on a rhythm, a life of its own, traveling from one buyer to the next, whispered between tradesmen, ministers, and neighbors until it became legend, and with legend came expectation, and with expectation came dread, so that those who were about to encounter her did so already primed with fear, their minds unconsciously shaping every glance, every gesture, every silent breath into confirmation of what the town already knew, that she was not merely a girl for sale, but a catalyst, a mirror, a presence that could not be contained by walls, chains, or authority. The cycle was terrifying. Gly methodical, interest, obsession, fear, madness, and it repeated regardless of intention, regardless of logic, regardless of the pious assurances of men who fancied themselves strong or wise, and some began to whisper of patterns in the chaos, patterns that suggested she was aware of the effect she had, that her stillness was not passive but active, that her silence was not ignorance but knowledge, and that she had endured the cruelty of the world not out of submission, but because it allowed her to watch, to measure, to catalogue, and perhaps, in the eyes of those who encountered her, to teach a lesson in humility, terror, and the fragile nature of human perception. With each new owner, These whispers gained detail, anecdotes about sleepless nights, obsessive observation, strange reflections in mirrors, animals reacting violently, shadows stretching unnaturally in her presence, words unspoken yet understood, and in some homes, men locked doors, barred windows, or even fled entirely, leaving her behind as if proximity alone could be fatal. And when she moved again, the stories accompanied her, whispered warnings followed her like a ghost, reinforcing the reputation that she had cultivated through nothing but the quiet patience of being exactly what she was, indifferent, calm, and profoundly aware. And as the whispers grew louder, spreading from plantation to village to town, it became clear that her effect was cumulative, each tale adding weight to the next, each observer contributing to the atmosphere of dread that clung to her like a second skin, so that by the time she reached yet another home, the story was already alive in the minds of those who awaited her, and fear preceded her arrival, making her presence seem larger, darker, more inevitable than it truly was, because now she was no longer just a girl. She'd become a legend, and in legend, the line between reality and nightmare disappears, leaving only the certainty that whatever comes next will test the limits of the mind, and that is exactly what she did. By the time she was sold to her fifth owner, the legend surrounding her had preceded her like a shadow, curling along hallways and whispering through the trees before she even arrived, and the man who purchased her, a wealthy but reclusive landowner, known more for his obsession with control than any compassion, believed that he could finally master what others had failed to contain, that by isolating her, by removing the distractions of a household, servants, and prying eyes, he could break the spell she seemed to cast over men. And so he prepared a cellar for her, deep and windowless, the air damp with the faint odor of mold and earth, reinforced the locks, chained the door with iron, and convinced himself that solitude would render her harmless, that confinement would allow him to study her, to understand her, to tame what had become an uncontrollable force of nature. And at first, the girl complied as she always did, stepping into the cellar quietly, placing her hands where instructed, settling onto the cold stone floor with the same patience that had unnerved every previous owner. Yet even in this confinement, where no one could see or interact with her, her presence made itself felt, a subtle tension that lingered in the air above the man, clinging to him like fog, slipping through the cracks of the door, pressing against his skin, curling into his hair, invading the corners of his mind where reason and skepticism once held sway. At first, nothing overt happened. She ate when she was offered food, moved when instructed, remained in her designated space, yet the silence itself became oppressive, a heavy, living weight that seemed to breathe, and the landowner found his thoughts growing fragmented, obsessive, unable to focus on ledger entries or correspondence, as if the very act of thinking provoked her awareness, that she was present not merely in body but in cognition, watching from somewhere unseen, cataloguing. His responses, noting every shiver, every twitch, every lapse of attention, and he told himself it was fear, that superstition was to blame, that he had inherited nothing more than a girl with an unfortunate history. Yet the certainty that he was being observed grew so insistent that he began to speak aloud when alone, testing his voice against the darkness, muttering questions he already knew the answers to, as if audibly challenging the emptiness could grant him some control. Nights were the worst, stretching into an endless void where sleep became a liability, where dreams no longer offered escape but mirrored the waking terror, for he began to hear her voice calling him by name, even when she remained in the cellar, soft at first, almost imperceptible, then growing clearer, closer, as if the sound emanated not from her lips but from the walls, the floor, the shadows themselves. And when he would rush to the cellar and throw open the iron-bound door, she would be exactly where she had been, seated patiently on the stone, eyes open, still, observing, saying nothing, her silence louder than any shout. He tried everything, discipline, reason, punishment, even prayer, but all were ineffective, his words bouncing off an invisible barrier that separated him from her in a way that was both complete and absolute, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, powerless. And in his waking hours, he began to notice strange phenomena. Doors he had locked tightly would be found ajar. Objects shifted slightly from their original positions, the faint impression of footprints that did not match his own, and always, always the feeling of being watched, a prickle at the base of his neck, a weight upon his chest, a certainty that he could not escape her gaze even when she was unseen. Desperation began to erode his reason, day bleeding into night without relief, until he became paranoid, hiding in rooms she had never entered, speaking through walls, convincing himself that the cellar itself was a conduit for some force beyond comprehension, that confinement had not contained her but amplified her presence, and in those moments he began to write letters he could not send, journal entries in which he catalogued every twitch, every whisper, every sensation, as though recording them might protect him or perhaps preserve his sanity, and the act of writing only made him more aware of the patterns, the inevitability, the unrelenting force of her observation, so that even when he closed his eyes, even when he tried to distract himself with work or meals or the sparse comforts of wealth, she was there, as if she had permeated the very air he breathed, a patient, unblinking sentinel of his mind. As the days stretched into weeks, the auditory hallucinations became undeniable, words whispered clearly in his ears, repeating phrases he had uttered moments before, repeating fears he had not yet articulated, and the line between the real and the imagined vanished entirely, leaving him suspended in a terror that could not be escaped or explained. And though he tried to rationalize, tried to convince himself that fatigue, isolation, or his own frailty were responsible, each attempt only strengthened the certainty that she had chosen him, that her quiet endurance was not passive but deliberate, a methodical test of the limits of human sanity. He began sleeping outside the cellar door, lantern clutched in trembling hands, eyes darting to shadows, ears straining for the softest sound. Yet even in this proximity, her presence pressed in, the silence growing intolerable, wrapping around him, whispering through the unseen, reminding him with every breath that control had never been his. That observation alone could unravel the strongest mind, and it was on the 20th night that the culmination of this terror arrived, sudden and violent, as a sound, something between a scream and a moan, echoed from the cellar, cutting through the darkness like a blade, and when he flung open the door, heart hammering, expecting to find some act of rebellion or injury, he found her seated, perfectly still, eyes wide and unblinking, and the scream had not come from her, had not come from the physical world at all, but from within him, his own mind fracturing under the relentless weight of observation, the impossible clarity of her awareness, the certainty that she had always known him better than he knew himself, and in the hours that followed he could not move, could not speak, could not leave the cellar, even though the door stood open, because a paralysis rooted not in chains but in fear had claimed him, and when neighbors finally arrived after days of silence and pounding on doors, they found him dead, hands clawed into the cold stone floor, eyes wide open, staring in the direction of the cellar, as though trying to communicate something beyond explanation, and she remained seated exactly where she had been placed, her calm untouched, her patience absolute, silent witness to the final unraveling of yet another man who had thought himself capable of possession, of control, of understanding, and as her next owner would soon learn, it was never about what she did, but about what she revealed, about the terrifying truth that some presences cannot be confined, cannot be explained, and cannot be survived, because they do not act, they simply are, and in their quiet, patient observation they expose the fragility of every mind that dares to meet their gaze. By the time she was moved from the ruins of the fifth owner's estate, the girl had become more than a person. She was a story, a shadow, a name whispered in terrified awe, and even those who had never seen her feared her as if proximity alone was a threat. Her reputation preceded her to the next home, where the final known owner awaited, a man of science, a doctor renowned for his intellect, his rational mind, and his certainty that all mysteries could be explained, categorized, and controlled. He had heard the rumors, of course, stories of madness, obsession, sleepless nights, and strange occurrences, but he dismissed them as superstition, the exaggerated tales of frightened villagers and gullible merchants, and when she arrived at his estate, he did not see a girl to be feared or revered. He saw a subject, a specimen, an opportunity to test the boundaries of human perception and behavior. From the moment she stepped onto his property, he observed her with meticulous attention, recording every detail of her posture, her gait, her expression, and even her breathing. As if by cataloguing these elements, he could identify some pattern or anomaly that would explain the chaos she left in her wake. She did not speak unless spoken to, did not react unless addressed, and yet the effect she had on him was immediate and insidious. Hours passed as he watched her move across the polished floors of his home, noting how her eyes would linger on the smallest of objects, how her hands fell precisely into place when performing menial tasks, and how her silence seemed to create a vacuum around her, pulling attention and thought toward her in ways that could not be measured by observation alone. He told himself that he was rational, that he could remain detached, but within days he noticed that his thoughts were no longer his own, ideas he had considered private, secrets he had carefully hidden from the world, even fears he had long suppressed, all bubbled unbidden to the surface of his consciousness, each one magnified by a presence that did not speak but watched, and though she remained seated, working, or simply still, he could feel her awareness pressing against the edges of his mind, as though she was scanning the contents of his memory with a precision that defied reason. He began to document every interaction, measuring her pulse, recording her breathing, timing her movements, attempting to find evidence of deception, manipulation, or abnormality, yet the results were inconclusive. Mundane even, giving nothing tangible to explain the terror that began to seep into his own nights. He awoke frequently, sweating, feeling eyes upon him even when the house was empty, hearing footsteps in the halls that did not exist, sensing a presence behind him when he was alone in the laboratory, and as the days became weeks, he began to understand the truth that the previous owners had only whispered about. She did not act to torment, to manipulate, or to harm, she simply was, and in being, she forced the observer to confront themselves in ways that could not be ignored. The doctor's rational mind, which had once dismissed superstition as foolishness, began to crumble under the relentless pressure of observation, and he realized, with growing horror, that no experiment could contain her, no measurement could predict her influence, and no theory could explain why she inspired fear, obsession, and madness in every man who came near her. One evening, as he examined her by lamplight, taking notes with trembling hands, he found that the very act of observation seemed to intensify her presence, that the more he tried to study her, the more acutely he felt that he was the subject, not the scientist, and the more he wrote, the less certain he became of reality. Shadows elongated unnaturally along the walls of the study, the candle flames flickered though no breeze disturbed them, and he began to hear soft whispers at the edge of hearing, phrases indistinct but unmistakably directed at him. Yet when he turned, she remained seated, silent, motionless, as if the world had narrowed to a point between her eyes and his mind. He began to question whether he had brought her into his home, or whether she had somehow entered the boundaries of his perception first, insinuating herself into the spaces between thought and observation. And though he tried to convince himself that it was fatigue, that he had overextended his own senses, the evidence of his journals, pages filled with increasingly erratic writing, notes scrawled in the margins of diagrams and anatomical sketches, obsessive observations repeated multiple times, made it clear that something far beyond natural explanation was occurring. Nights became unbearable. Sleep offered no respite. Instead, he awoke in darkness to find her silhouette at the foot of his bed, the details of the room rearranged as though to emphasize her presence, and though he had not observed her moving, he could sense her awareness in the faintest sounds, the brush of air, the whisper of a floorboard, the shifting of shadows. And with every waking moment, he felt the walls of reason closing in, the fragile edifice of rationality cracking under pressure. He began to record dreams as well as waking observations, the dreams vivid and precise, echoing his fears and amplifying them, in which she spoke directly to him, not in words but in understanding, conveying with a glance or tilt of her head the truths he had spent his life suppressing or denying, and though these experiences were subjective, the intensity was undeniable, leaving him shaking and incapable of distinguishing waking from dreaming. As the weeks progressed, he attempted to test her in every conceivable manner. placing obstacles, hiding objects, speaking in multiple languages, introducing strangers, but each experiment failed to produce a predictable result. She complied, ignored, or merely observed, and each failure drove him further into obsession, compelled to continue, compelled to prove to himself and the world that there was an explanation, that she was merely human, that he could master her as all others had tried and failed. Yet the more he sought to assert control, the more obvious it became that control was an illusion, that he was being studied as meticulously as he attempted to study her, and the sensation of being constantly observed, of his own thoughts and reactions, catalogued and analyzed, intensified to the point that he could no longer eat or write without feeling her presence pressing down upon him, guiding his hand, shaping his focus, insinuating herself into the very process of reasoning. At night, he would wake to whispers in the hallways, not the girl's voice, but some echo of it, his own name spoken softly, a cadence that seemed impossible yet entirely precise, as though the walls themselves had become instruments tuned to her observation. And in these moments, he realized that no method, no scientific rigor, no discipline of the mind could defend him against what he was confronting, that the madness he had dismissed in others was inescapable for anyone in her presence. And then, one morning, he awoke to find the estate in disarray, papers scattered, equipment overturned, and yet there was no sign of forced entry, no tracks, no explanation beyond the certainty that she had been there, always there, in some manner that transcended the physical limitations of the world. And as he stared at the chaos, he realized, with a terrifying clarity, that his understanding of reality itself had been challenged, that she had shifted the parameters of perception, that the influence she exerted could not be quantified, controlled, or contained, and that the very act of being near her altered the fabric of experience. In his final journal entries, scrawled hastily, he admitted what he had long suspected but could not reconcile with reason. She was neither evil nor good, neither human nor non-human, but something beyond categorization, a presence whose existence exposed the fragility of the mind, the vulnerability of those who believed themselves rational, the impossibility of mastery over what could not be defined, and yet she remained seated, silent, patient, unblinking, as if the entire sequence of observation, madness, and documentation had been part of some deliberate instruction, a test, a revelation delivered with the quiet inevitability that had characterized her entire life. Weeks later, the estate burned in a fire of unknown origin, leaving no bodies, no remains, only ruins and scattered journals filled with obsessions, observations, and the faint traces of a presence that could not be extinguished. And in the aftermath, the townsfolk whispered that she had been seen walking away from the flames, calm and unharmed. And as the story spread, it became clear that this final sale, this encounter with the rational man who believed science could explain all, was not the end of her legend, but rather the proof of it, that she existed beyond fear, beyond control, beyond understanding, and that anyone who encountered her, regardless of faith, wealth, or knowledge, would come to know sooner or later that some presences are beyond comprehension, and in being reveal the deepest truths and terrors of those who dare to witness them. When the final owner's estate burned to ruins, leaving only scattered journals and the faint whisper of her presence, the girl vanished from recorded history, as if the world itself had decided to erase her from memory. Yet the echoes of her existence remained, lingering in the air, carried in the terrified whispers of those who had glimpsed her, and in the minds of men who had survived the ordeal long enough to speak of her at all. She was no longer merely a girl for sale, no longer an object to be possessed or observed, but something more insidious, something that existed in the interstices of rumor and reality, a phantom whose presence could be felt long before she was seen, and whose impact did not require proximity, for the stories themselves had become contagious, infecting the minds of those who listened with the same unease, obsession, and dread that had afflicted every man who had ever owned her. People claimed to see her wandering along roadsides, appearing suddenly at auction yards, in small towns, or on the outskirts of villages, always calm, always silent, always observing, as though her task was not to interact but to watch, and wherever she appeared, the familiar pattern followed. Men would stop speaking, hearts racing, hands trembling, unable to look away, drawn into the subtle gravity of her attention, while others, watching from a distance, would feel the invisible pull of her presence, a pressure on the chest, a whisper at the edge of thought, a creeping certainty that nothing would ever be the same after crossing her path. Some insisted she had the ability to reach into the private corners of the mind, to examine thoughts not yet formed, to reveal secrets no one dared admit, and those who came into contact with her were forever changed, haunted by an awareness that their own darkness, their own obsession, and their own fears had been seen and catalogued, exposed in a way that could not be undone. The legend of her observation grew, spreading faster than any physical journey she could make. As travelers carried accounts from town to town, each witness embellishing the story with new details, each retelling reinforcing the terror that had surrounded her life, until she became more than human, more than a girl. She became an idea, a force, a measure of the fragility of the mind itself. Some claimed to glimpse her in mirrors at night, not a reflection but a shadow of calm, unblinking observation, appearing behind them when they thought themselves alone, and the knowledge that they had been watched, even fleetingly, was enough to provoke insomnia, anxiety, and the slow unraveling of rational thought, while dogs and other animals reacted violently in her presence, shying away, refusing to enter rooms, or staring at empty space with the same unease as humans, further reinforcing the notion that her presence extended beyond the physical, reaching into the natural world in ways impossible to understand. The stories became darker with time, detailing men collapsing, weeping or screaming in silence after brief encounters, or even after hearing her name spoken, and the whispers spoke of a woman who carried neither malice nor kindness, who did nothing except exist, yet whose existence was so profoundly unsettling that it exposed the vulnerabilities, obsessions, and hidden guilt of anyone near her. Some theorized that she did not age, that the years failed to touch her, that she remained constant while the world around her changed, and that this permanence, this refusal to succumb to time, made her appear supernatural, eternal, unstoppable, and utterly unknowable. Others speculated that she was a mirror of the human soul, reflecting back not who they wanted to be, but who they truly were, and in seeing themselves so plainly, men went mad because they could not bear the truth, because the layers of societal pretense, reason, and morality peeled away in the presence of her calm, unblinking gaze. Witnesses described sudden obsessions, the compulsion to follow her movements, to watch her even when it was impossible, to retrace her steps, to examine her path, and these obsessions often became dangerous, resulting in accidents, disappearances, and sometimes deaths, as if proximity to her, whether physical or through rumor, carried a tangible force that acted on the mind as much as the environment. Travelers reported seeing her in multiple towns in a single day, sometimes miles apart, and while some dismissed these sightings as coincidence, the consistency of descriptions, her posture, her silence, her deliberate, measured movements, the stillness in her eyes, created an undeniable pattern, and those who encountered her often noted a feeling of time stretching or folding around her, moments becoming elastic, hours passing with a weight that could not be measured by clocks, and a sense of inevitability, that whatever she observed would leave an imprint on reality itself. In the years that followed, stories circulated that men who once sought to own her were permanently altered, their obsessions lingering long after she had vanished, their minds consumed by fragments of memory, dream and rumor that coalesced into nightmares that haunted waking hours. Families reported husbands who would not speak of her, men who refused to leave their homes, who spent nights pacing, staring at empty corners, convinced that the girl had returned, watching, waiting, assessing their every action, and in some cases whole estates fell into disrepair, abandoned after their owners succumbed to madness, leaving behind belongings arranged in obsessive patterns, journals filled with incoherent notes, and the lingering sense of observation, as though she had never left. Even children, innocent and unknowing, would shiver when the name was mentioned, claiming that she appeared briefly in their peripheral vision, that shadows moved unnaturally in her wake, and that the animals of the household, the family dog, the farm cats, would avoid her presence or react with sudden fear when she was nearby. Folklore grew, embellishing her story further, claiming she could walk through locked doors, vanish and appear at will, remain unseen yet palpable, and sense thoughts before they were formed. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as superstition, yet the sheer number of consistent reports, coupled with the tragic fates of those who attempted to study or own her, made skepticism increasingly difficult to maintain, and a fearful respect developed around the idea of her, that even mentioning her in casual conversation carried risk, as if words alone could summon the attention of a presence that had never been conquered. As decades passed, her legend evolved, leaving behind the girl herself as less a person than a concept, a test of sanity, a revelation of hidden human weakness, a mirror to the obsessions, fears, and guilt that men carry within them, a measure of the fragility of reason when confronted by something beyond understanding, and in this way she remained alive, moving through history not in body but in influence, appearing to those who were attuned to her presence, the unlucky, the curious, the foolish, the bold, and in every encounter leaving traces of awareness that no man could shake, that no man could explain, that no man could survive without change. The enduring nature of these stories, whispers, rumors, and first-hand accounts, kept her memory alive across generations, traveling faster than any distance she could physically traverse, cementing her reputation as a figure whose influence could not be contained by geography, time, or circumstance, and creating an understanding, however subtle, that to encounter her was to confront the ultimate question of the human mind. How much can a person withstand when faced with something they cannot comprehend, something that does not act in malice, but simply exists in a way that reveals the fragility of their own perception, and in revealing it, exposes the unspoken fears, desires, and obsessions that lurk in the shadows of thought. Some modern accounts suggest sightings even decades later, individuals claiming fleeting glimpses of a calm, unblinking figure walking along quiet roads, entering abandoned estates, appearing at the edge of auctions, yet never speaking, never interacting, never aging. And while these reports cannot be verified, they persist, as if her essence is bound not to flesh but to consciousness itself, a reminder that some presences, some stories, do not end, do not fade, do not die, but linger, patient and unyielding, waiting for minds to encounter them, waiting for attention to make them real again. And so even after she disappeared from the physical world, her impact endured, an unseen force shaping lives, testing the limits of sanity, and proving once and for all that some legends are not born of exaggeration, but of the inescapable truth of human vulnerability when confronted by the unknown. By the time her presence became more legend than life, it was clear to those who had survived encounters with her, or even merely heard the whispers of her existence, that the girl who had been sold as ugly was never truly a person meant to be understood, measured, or owned. She had transcended the limitations of body and society, becoming a force of inevitability, a mirror reflecting not what men desired or feared to see in her, but what they most feared to see in themselves. And in this revelation lay the true horror, for no man could resist the pull of self-exposure, the undeniable confrontation with his own obsessions, greed, lust, and weakness, and every attempt to rationalize, to ignore, to dominate her presence only amplified the effect, driving even the most disciplined minds to the brink of collapse. Stories proliferated of men who had attempted to own her in the decades that followed, men of wealth, knowledge, faith, or cruelty, each confident that they would be different, each convinced they had discernment enough to succeed where others had failed, and yet the pattern persisted: sleepless nights, obsessive thoughts, subtle manipulations of reality that left the rational mind questioning its own stability, inexplicable accidents, or sudden collapses into madness, until the mere thought of encountering her could evoke panic, hallucinations, or trembling, as if her gaze, though unseen, existed everywhere at once, a patient, unblinking observer of humanity's fragile psyche. It was said that she could stand in a room and not move for hours, yet her presence would dominate every perception, every sound, every thought in the house, a weight that could not be lifted. And the silence itself became a weapon, an instrument of exposure, revealing the unacknowledged desires, fears, and moral failings of anyone nearby, so that when a man finally left her presence, he was not free. He was irrevocably altered, carrying within him an unshakable memory of being seen in ways that could not be unobserved, as if she had written herself into his consciousness, a permanent ledger of his soul that demanded reckoning. Scholars and chroniclers who attempted to write her story found themselves entangled in similar phenomena, manuscripts disappearing overnight, notes rearranged into incoherent patterns, pens moving as if by unseen hands, and a pervasive sense that the act of observation itself had consequences, that she existed not just in flesh, but in awareness, in cognition, in the liminal space where reality and perception intersect, and in this, the impossibility of defining her became absolute. Over the years, towns where she had been seen became the focus of rumor and fear. Locals claimed to feel a weight in the air when she passed, a tension that could not be explained by weather or architecture, an invisible pressure that made the ordinary seem distorted, that stretched seconds into eternity and made the most mundane of sounds, a creaking door, the fall of a leaf, a whisper in the night, into evidence of her watching. Children spoke of shadows that did not belong, of glimpses of calm, unblinking eyes in hallways, and dogs, even generations later, would react instinctively to a presence that was not there, refusing to enter rooms, whining at corners, staring at empty air, as though memory itself could carry the residue of observation, the psychic imprint of her being. Some claimed she had the power to traverse time in a subtle way, appearing to men decades after previous encounters or manifesting simultaneously in places miles apart. And though skeptics dismissed these reports, the consistency and terrifying detail of the accounts lent them credibility, creating a story that refused to be contained, a force that could not be catalogued or tamed. Researchers who attempted to rationalize her existence, to reduce her to a pattern of psychology or coincidence, found themselves trapped by the very logic they sought to apply, as if the act of inquiry opened the mind to new vulnerabilities, exposing the hidden obsessions and fears that she had always exploited, revealing the horrifying truth that her power was not supernatural in the sense of magic or curses, but absolute in its simplicity, she observed, and the mind, unprepared for such scrutiny, unraveled. Even those who never encountered her directly, who only read the stories, reported unease, insomnia, and intrusive thoughts, suggesting that her influence was not confined to the physical, but spread through cognition, through imagination, through awareness, so that she became more than a girl, more than a story, more than a cautionary legend. She became a measure of human vulnerability, a force that exposed the fragility, vanity, and obsession inherent in those who believe they are in control. Folklore evolved, recounting instances where men would see her silhouette at the edge of the forest, standing at market squares, seated quietly at the threshold of a home, and wherever she appeared, the same patterns unfolded: obsession, dread, sleepless nights, and sometimes sudden insanity, as though the world itself conspired to amplify her presence, to make her the unavoidable truth staring back at anyone foolish enough to attempt mastery. The truth no one could say, however, was not that she was malevolent, or even intentionally destructive, but that she was a mirror held up to humanity, that her existence was proof that nothing could be fully controlled, fully understood, or fully possessed, and that the terror she inspired was not a reflection of her actions, but of what she revealed in others. In this sense, she became immortal, not by physical longevity, but by her ability to persist in the minds of men, to haunt generations, to turn curiosity into fear, to transform observation into obsession, and to expose, without malice, the frailty of every ego and every soul confronted by her calm, unblinking awareness. Some stories even suggested that she could vanish from one place and appear in another, seemingly instantaneously, or be glimpsed in multiple locations within a single day, defying the laws of time and space. And these accounts, whether true or exaggerated by fear, reinforced the sense of inevitability surrounding her existence, that wherever attention lingered, her presence followed, patient, silent, observing. Even religious figures, scholars, and rational men who prided themselves on reason and discipline succumbed, each encounter reinforcing the same cycle: fascination, obsession, dread, and madness, and all concluded, sooner or later, that to face her was not to face an object, a person, or a creature, but the unadulterated truth of themselves, stripped of societal expectations, moral veneers, and intellectual arrogance. leaving only the raw vulnerability of thought, emotion, and awareness. Those who survived to tell their stories, or to leave written accounts, warned generations not to underestimate her, not to attempt ownership, not to treat her as a subject of curiosity, for any attempt to master, measure, or define her would be met with a subtle, inexorable force that revealed not what she was, but what the observer had always been beneath the surface, weak, obsessed, fearful, and vulnerable to the slow, methodical pressure of perception. And the lesson, carried forward in whispers, journals, and fearful legend, remained the same across centuries. She was neither cruel nor kind, neither villain nor victim, but a force beyond understanding, an unblinking witness to the human mind, patient, constant, and eternal. And in recognizing this, all who heard her story understood, at last, the terrifying truth that had been concealed beneath the words of those who could not survive her presence. Some things are not meant to be possessed, some truths cannot be confronted directly, and some presences, calm, silent, and watchful, exist only to reveal the fragility and madness that lurk within every human soul. And so, though she vanished from sight, she never truly left, for her existence endured in every fearful glance, every sleepless night, every whisper of dread, in the spaces way. The mind confronts itself and finds it cannot escape the gaze of something that observes perfectly, patiently, and without end, leaving behind a story, a legend, a lesson written not in words, but in the trembling hearts and haunted minds of all who came too close, and in the realization that the most terrifying truths are often the ones reflected back at us, unblinking, unyielding, eternal, and that some stories, no matter how many years pass, never truly end. Before we close this chapter of darkness, dear viewers, remember to subscribe to Midnight Epoch, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment sharing how chilling and captivating this story was for you, because tales like these are meant to linger in your mind long after the screen goes dark.